Guys, welcome back to Revive School. It's been a full week, Kevin. We continue the study of one of the more intriguing books of all of the Bible. Just as a quick review, Revelation 1:4. You got to remember, in Revelation 1:4, it kind of gives a summary, really, of all of the book of Revelation. Remember this, John, to the seven churches in Asia, grace and peace to you from the one who is, who was, and who is coming. So you have this description, this literally vision of Christ in chapter 1, right? Who is. Who was is this image of who he was to the seven churches, right? And that image of chapters 2 and 3. And then who is coming is in reference to chapters 4 and 5, but really 6 and on through 22. So what you're going to see is that we are covering the end of Revelation 1:4 even today. This is the imagery that we have. I love how the book of Revelation is broken up. And it's based on Revelation 1:4. Now, yesterday, really, let me back up 2 days ago. In Revelation 16, we've gone through, Kevin, if you go to our timeline, we've gone through what's called the seven trumpets. Now, these seven trumpets, have been given, after the seven trumpets, we've gone into the seven bowls of wrath. Now, Kevin, you have this image of one of the four living creatures. These are one of the four living creatures that are worshiping the Lord in the heavenly throne room. One of these living creatures is handing a bowl to every one of these angels, seven angels. So Revelation 16 is you have these angels that are dumping out the wrath of God. Now, when you go to Revelation 17, you begin to have this image of the fall of Babylon, the fall of the harlot, the system of these worldly powers that are influenced by Satan. And then eventually, you guys, what we're going to in Revelation 17 is the Antichrist. Now, this is where it gets crazy, right, Kevin? The Antichrist and the 10 horns, they even buck that whole system, right? They're like, no, we don't even want anything to do with that. But that's the battle that's going on because they're going to come and wage war against the Lamb. All of this still hasn't happened yet. In the sense of the Battle of Armageddon, it's still not happened. Christ has still not come back yet, okay? Hopefully you're all there. So in 17, you see the fall of this language of the religious system of Babylon falling. Now in 18, you see the commercial and the political side of the harlot of Babylon. Okay, so 17 is more of the religious system that's falling. 18 is more about the political and economic system. And then I'll just tell you, 19 is Christ comes back. Why I want to say those, why did I go through all of that system? Can you go back to the wrath for me though, Kevin? Why did I want to go through the wrath? Because this one right here, this has all happened, okay? So when you see and jump into 18, and I think one of our friends, Wendy Howard, had mentioned this in between one of our recordings. It's kind of a cool picture. All of these people, they're still experiencing these things, right? So they're coming to fight. They're still in the darkness. So in Revelation 18, after this, I saw another angel with great authority coming down from heaven, and the earth was illuminated by its splendor, by his splendor. Kevin, why is that important?
Because they had darkness.
Because there's darkness. So this angel is coming with great authority, coming down from heaven. And the next thing you know, everybody is experiencing literally God's glory through this angel. And that's the crazy thing is, you guys, they're going through all these things and they begin to see a glimmer of light. Now in verses 1 through 8, really 1 through 3, let me just put it a different way. I like Tom Constable, used to be a former professor of mine at Dallas Theological Seminary. And he basically begins to announce judgment is coming again. Judgment is coming to Babylon for the first 3 verses. Now, when you bring in another guy that we haven't talked about in a long time, Warren Wiersbe. Warren Wiersbe says, look, what you're going to see in these first 3 verses is a voice of condemnation, a voice of, Rich, you looked up the definition of that. What was that?
It is the expression of very strong disapproval or the action of condemning someone to a punishment. Okay, so an angel is coming down, illuminated from God's presence, right? Coming down, he's going to talk about God's displeasure for Babylon. So he cried in a mighty voice, I'm in verse 2, it has fallen. Babylon the Great has fallen. Now we're not talking specifically about the Babylon city, right? From the old days. We're talking about the system that it represents. This system has become a dwelling for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and despicable beast. In other words, basically, this harlot has invited pretty much everything.
Anything unclean, let's make this a part of our home. Now, crazy enough, it says she has become a dwelling place for demons. Normally, the demonic is in the bottomless pit, but here you have this image of this system is so corrupt that even the demonic is present in all of this. I got to keep saying this, you guys. In Ephesians 6, like the reality is, like the demonic are present today. Why the church doesn't address the enemy, I will never know. Why don't we talk about, it says our battle in Ephesians 6:12, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world powers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. Folks, it is literally the angelic beings are fighting on our behalf at times. The angels versus the fallen angels, the demons. And the system is currently being dwelled with the demonic. And that even happens today. And so here you have verse 3, it says this, for all the nations have drunk the wine of her sexual immorality. This sounds, Kevin, very similar to Revelation 17, doesn't it? They're participating. If you go to that picture, Kevin, here you have this harlot holding up her cup. Here you have, the 7 mountains, the 7 hills, 7 kingdoms possibly, right? Then you have the 2 horns on each, and then you have the 10 horns. The point is that other nations are participating with this system, which brings wrath. So because they're all participating, the wrath of God is coming. The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown wealthy from her excessive luxury. So remember how yesterday we talked more about the religious side. This is more about the economic participation with the system. The merchants are growing wealthy, right? You see how this happens? The kings of the earth are committing sexual immorality with her. And so here is this image that we're seeing. And then it says this in verse 4, and this is where it gets really interesting. We talked about condemnation, right? The condemnation, judgment is coming to Babylon. Babylon, and I like this, has fallen. Like it is no longer going to be. But at the same time, I love what Warren Wiersbe says, now you can begin to see what we would call a separation, a voice of separation. Here you have the voice of condemnation. Now you have a voice of separation. Then I heard another voice from heaven. This is John. He hears a voice from heaven, and here's what he hears. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins or receive any of her plagues. In other words, Babylon, the fallen system, don't you dare, as believers, don't you go near this place. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins or receive any of her plagues. He's calling God's own to basically, I like what John MacArthur says, disentangle themselves from the world. Don't you dare associate yourselves in this context. It says in verse 5, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. In other words, I need you to leave this environment. So here's what I like. Warren Wiersbe does 2 things. Why would God ask God's people, to not participate in the harlot, in the Babylonian mentality? Okay? One is to avoid pollution. I love this language. Avoid being polluted by the worldly system. Kevin, if you go to Revelation, actually, go to 1 Timothy 5:22, please. 1 Timothy 5:22 has this mentality of avoid the pollution mentality. It says, don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder, and don't share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Same mentality. Okay, be careful about who you associate. Don't share in their sins. Keep yourself pure. And then here's another one, number 2. Warren Wiersbe says, 1, you're avoiding pollution by not being a partaker of their sin. But 2, maybe God's people might be spared the terrible plagues that He's actually going to bring onto that place, that physical location. So if you're in that environment, I need you to leave. It's just a thought. Okay, either way, He's saying clearly, guys, I need you to separate yourselves from them. Kevin?
It's not it shouldn't be a new message. I mean, we talked all through the Old Testament. God's trying to separate His people. They're not to intermarry. They're not. Right. They're not to look like the people of the world that they have to live.
We need to be a light. We need to be different because judgment is falling on Babylon. So, Kevin, if you look back historically, yes, that would work. If you look through the future, it's a little hard to process. Now, if you continue on in Revelation 18, verse 6, now watch this. It says, pay her back the way she also paid, and double it according to her works. In the cup which she mixed, can you go back? There it is. Here it is. There's that cup. In the cup which she mixed, mix a double portion for her. In other words, slip something in there and double it. Pay her back in everything that she did. In other words, I need you to double the judgment. Can you go to Isaiah 51, verse 19? I need you to repay God the wrath of God to herself. The wrath that she poured onto us. Isaiah 51, verse 19. Isaiah 51:19 says, these two things have happened to you, devastation and destruction, famine and sword. Who will grieve for you? How can I comfort you? Verse 20, your children have fainted. They lie at the head of every street like an antelope in a net. They are full of the Lord's fury, the rebuke of your God. And then in 21, so listen to this, afflicted and drunken one, but not with wine. God is going to pour it out and he's going to double it. Man, that's crazy, you guys. Verse 22 really is a good verse as well. This is what the Lord says, Yahweh, even your God, who defends his people. Look, I have removed the cup of staggering from your hand, the goblet, the cup of my fury. You will never drink it again. Okay, so here you have, you guys. The angel calls for God to recompense, and I like what MacArthur says, to Babylon in her own cup to repay her own, right? To repay her according to her deeds. So she's delighting in it now. And by the way, get out of there, guys, because it's going to be bad. Double the judgment is coming. Verse 7 says, as much as she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, give her that much torment and grief. Because she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, I am not a widow, and I will never see grief. In other words, she is full on delighting in her own pride, in her own self-righteousness. And as much as she sits in her self-righteousness, God, would you double that and pour out the wrath? And so what does he keep saying to those, right? In 4 through 8, guys, get out of there. Because in verse 8 it says, therefore her plagues will come in one day. Death and grief and famine. The whole system, the whole worldly system of the economic and the political system that's not of God will be burned up with fire because the Lord God who judges her is mighty. You can play the game, well, why would God do that? God's a loving God. God has given them plenty of chances. Babylon had no problem glorifying themselves, right? God says, no, you need to glorify me. Oh man, it's kind of crazy. And in one day, Babylon will fall. Can you go to Daniel 5, verse 30 and 31? Daniel 5, 30 and 31. This is kind of an interesting picture. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, also known as the Babylonians, was killed. Darius the Mede, you guys, literally in one night came in and cleaned house. Verse 31 of Daniel 5 says, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at age 62. So Kevin, just like that, one kingdom can fall in one day, 1 hour, one night. And I think that's the point, is that we've seen this historically. God's going to do it again. It's kind of a powerful picture about how all of this continues to lead to literally a special destruction. So, because this is happening, condemnation is coming, right? I love what Warren Wiersbe says. And then clearly he says, separate yourself. But in this is where it gets weird. Verse 9, okay, and on, there is lamenting. Who's going to lament? Surely it's not going to be the believers. They're not going to lament over Babylon falling. It's those that do business with the system. Those that are going to lose their profit are going to be lamenting. So you have different groups, okay? So it says this in verse 9, the kings of the earth who have committed sexual immorality and live luxuriously with her will weep and mourn over her when they see the smoke of her burning. So, Kevin, you have kings lamenting because their sexual sins, I don't mean that literally, because of their immorality and all of their luxurious living, it's gone. So here you have kings now lamenting, and they're not believers. They're lamenting because they can't get what they want.
They're putting their faith in their wealth.
You have political leaders weeping because they see that the empire that they put everything in, gone. Right? It's like investing into the stock market and everything just gone. And the kings are literally crushed because I put all my stock in them. What What do you mean? The Antichrist empire is not it. It's kind of an interesting perspective. In verse 10, it says, they will stand far off of her torment, off in fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the mighty city, for in a single hour your judgment has come. There's that language again of that single hour, a little while. We don't know what that period of time is. It could range from 3.5 years to an hour, right? Either way, judgment is going to come, and it's going to come quickly. And the kings are in fear. Now there's another group in verse 11 through 13. It says, the merchants of the earth. So you have kings that are lamenting, and now you have merchants. The merchants of the earth will also weep and mourn over her because no one buys their merchandise any longer. Nobody's buying their little stuffed animals. Just kidding, it describes them here. There's no stuffed animals. It says merchandise of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, Xbox games. No, it doesn't say any of that. But that's what we're talking about, you guys. We're talking about all of their products. Nobody's buying it. Fine fabrics of linen, purple, silk, scarlet, all kinds of fragrant wood products are here today. All kinds of fragrant wood products, objects of ivory, objects of expensive wood, brass, iron, and marble. I don't know why. That's funny to me. It shouldn't be. But here's the point. They are literally going to lose, you guys, like their business. Cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine wheat, flour, grain, cattle, sheep, horses, carriages, and slaves, and human lives. Literally, costly perfumes, the frankincense, like all of these things, you guys, nobody's buying, Kevin, anymore. Supply and demand, it's just kind of out the window. Interesting enough, when it says slaves and human lives, I do think there's an insight in this. I do wonder, in the end system, I do wonder if the slave trade is still relevant and real at that time. Like, I'm actually talking about slave trade in the sense of like during Antichrist's commercial system, MacArthur proposes possibly you'll see slavery reappear. And I'm not saying it's not already here, actually. There could be some places that clearly it's already in existence. I mean, I think of the sex trafficking in that aspect itself. So I don't know what that looks like, but clearly it's taking place. Kings are lamenting. Babylon has fallen. Merchants are lamenting because, man, nobody's buying my stuff. Kind of crazy. Then it gets on to verse 14. Verse 14 says, the fruit you craved has left you. All your splendid and glamorous things are gone. They will never find them again. The merchants of these things will become rich, who became rich from her. And here's that same language, you guys, as the kings. They'll stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning. Why are they afraid, Kevin? What's the fear?
The fear is that what has happened to the Babylonian system is going to happen to them.
That's right. The merchants say in verse 16, in fear and of torment, woe, woe, the great city, clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. Do you see how they're describing it? They're describing as, we love this system. Everything looks great, but in a single hour, such fabulous wealth was destroyed. Just like that, the kings and the merchants of all of this system are in fear because, is this going to happen to us? And how am I supposed to make a living? And yet at the same time, Kevin, if you go back to the wrath, like I don't fully understand all of this, but there's a concept to this. They could be experiencing these things as well, right? I mean, that's a fair statement. They could be going through some of these things. Now there's another group, okay? There's another group of people. What are they doing? They're lamenting. They're lamenting like over a city, over Babylon. It's all selfish lamenting. You realize that, right? They're all selfishly lamenting because they don't want it to happen to them, and they don't know what they're going to do. So here's the third group. And it says, and every shipmaster, seafarer, the sailors, and all who do business by sea stood far off. So we'll just call them sea people. Here's what's interesting. Does this bother you as well? What's the sea already?
It's blood.
It's blood. So they clearly have seen, again, we don't know the timing of all of this, but the reality is if they saw all of this unfold on Babylon, this is impacting them. They don't remember earlier on. Remember in the trumpets, wasn't it the trumpets that you had a third of the ships destroyed? So now here they are. They're standing back. Normally they do business by the sea, and then it says this in verse 18: as they watched the smoke from her burning and kept crying out, "Who is like the great city?" You know what that means? We don't know anybody that's better than Babylon. We don't know anybody that's better in this system. We have no hope. That's what this verse says, verse 18. Let me just say this, maybe a drastic statement, but I actually think a lot of us are like sea people. You know, you're in a scenario in your life, think about this, you put everything into something and then it just goes away. And then where do you turn to? Do you turn to the thing that was destroyed, your business, your car, your family, or do you realize that the Lord's bigger than any of those situations? The sea people, they literally thought Babylon was the answer. And they're lamenting over the fact that it's just temporary. So here's what they did. In verse 18, Revelation 18:19, it says they threw dust on their heads and they kept crying out. Now at that point, Kevin, wouldn't you think when you hear dust on their heads, you think sackcloth and ashes? Wouldn't you start thinking repentance? Wouldn't you start thinking about crying out to the Lord? No, it says they kept crying out, weeping and mourning, and they say, "Woe, woe, the great city." Here it is again. This is their selfish lamenting. Where all those who have ships on the sea became rich from her wealth, for in a single hour she was destroyed. So in a single hour, maybe 60 minutes, maybe a period of time, literally Babylon is gone, which means all of their livelihood as well. We don't know. Like, are they experiencing sores? Are they experiencing heat? Are they experiencing the darkness? What are they experiencing? And at this point right now, they're lamenting when we have nothing to pay for. If only, you guys, they would have lamented and cried out to the Lord. Can you go to Joshua 7, verse 6 for me, please? Joshua 7, verse 6 says they threw dust, Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell before the ark of the Lord with his face to the ground until evening. As did the elders of Israel, they all put dust on their heads. You guys, they did this before the Lord, Kevin. They lamented before the Lord. If you go to 1 Samuel 4:12. In a period of time, the question is when everything's ripped away, the ships, the businesses, the wealth. In 1 Samuel 4:12, it says, that same day a Benjamite man ran from the battle and came to Shiloh. His clothes were torn and there was dirt on his head. There is this period of lamenting. Lamenting. That's all this image is. And you can see this in all of these stories. And literally, you guys, you could go throughout all the Old Testament. You can see this in 1 Samuel 4. You can see this in 2 Samuel 1. You can see this in 2 Samuel 15. You can see this in Job. Kevin, you want to go to Job 2, verse 12? I think this is a pretty powerful image here. In Job 2, it says, when they looked from a distance, they could barely recognize him. Right? They wept aloud, and each man tore his robe, threw dust into the air and on his heads. It's constantly this lamenting period of time. The sea people are lamenting. And I have to wonder, Kevin, who are they crying out to? Right? Who do they cry out to? So let's go back, if we can, Revelation 18, specifically verse 20. So here you have, so far, Wiersbe says it this way, right? You have had a voice of condemnation, right? Which is coming to Babylon, correct? And then we had what was called separation, a voice of separation, right? And that's coming to the people of God, correct? Over the period of time. And then you have the lamentation, right? And those are those people who do business, work. They have a relationship with Babylon. And then I like what Wiersbe says here. And then the last part is you're going to see a celebration. It's kind of an interesting language here. But what you see in verses 20 through 24, it says, rejoice over her, heaven, and you saints, apostles, and prophets, because God has executed your judgment on her. Heaven. And all that it encompasses, saints, apostles, prophets, believers, guess what? God is now going to bring forth the wrath of God on all of the system that has brought destruction to you. He's going to bring about judgment. And God says, I want you to celebrate this. I want you to delight in this. I want you to find joy in the judgment of Babylon. How crazy is this? I love the movie Avengers. I love all of that. Revelation 18:20 is God playing the avenger role. God decides to avenge the persecution, the death, the martyrdom, the tribulation stuff. He's going to bring it back on them. That cup, yeah, he's going to make her drink it. The harlot is going to drink double the judgment. And then he says in verse 21, oh, by the way, a mighty angel enters the picture. He picks up a stone, like a large millstone, and then what does he do? He throws it into the sea that, Rich, we didn't know, at least if it does exist, it's full of blood. He threw it into the sea, saying, in this way, Babylon the great city. So it's this stone, Kevin, I think I just said Kevage. In this way, Kevage, Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down violently and never be found again. It's the millstone, you guys. It's literally going to drop into the sea and nobody's going to find. And because of that, in verse 22, here you have the celebration. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters will never be heard in you again, right? So when I say the celebration, it's not coming, by the way, from the Babylonians. Never be heard in you again. No craftsman of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a mill will never be heard in you again. Think about this, you guys. None of this, the fall of Babylon, the only celebration that's going to happen, you guys, is coming from heaven. It says in verse 23, the light of a lamp will never shine in you again. It's done. The voice of a groom and a bride will never be heard in you again. There'll be no growth, in other words, no marriages. Nothing is going to continue on. All of this will happen because your merchants were the nobility of the earth. Because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And it says, and the blood of prophets and saints and of all those slaughtered on earth was found in you. Babylon the Great has now fallen. The system that's been against the kingdom of God, the system that's been against politically, economically, and religiously, that's been against Jesus, the Lamb of God, has now literally like a millstone, like a stone, been chucked into the sea and will never be found again. It's done. And Revelation 19 talks about how this is going to come to fruition, but he says prophetically, all of this is going to take place. I like what Tom Constable says. He says, hey, there's 3 reasons why Babylon has fallen. And this is a summary really of 17 and 18. He says this, first of all, men whom the world regards and they have a great love, enrich themselves. They lifted themselves up because of pride. Because of their influence with Babylon, pride has led them to be destroyed. That's one of the major reasons that destruction is coming to Babylon, pride. And then as a result of the first reason, because of pride, Babylon has then seduced all of the other nations. So the harlot is saying, hey guys, I need you to come over. Look at me. I'm the best. I'm the best. And that's the second reason. You have seduced the nations. And then the third one, I think, is just as great as all of the others. Because of your slewing and killing and destroying the saints, I will wipe you out. God's done with Babylon. He's done with the harlot. And how does this look? Well, you'll find out tomorrow in Revelation 19 when Jesus comes in and cleans house. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks.